Welcome back to my channel. In this video we're going to talk about factor by grouping. All right, so this is a form of factoring whenever you have four terms. So you can only factor by grouping when you have four terms. So remember that you will only try this method when you have how many terms? Four terms. All righty. Before we can talk about factor by grouping, I want us to look at just a simple factor example where we factor out the GCF, because this is going to help us. This is going to help us in our factor by grouping. So before I show you how to factor by grouping, let's first look at just a simple example of factoring out a GCF that is going to help us be able to factor by grouping. So we want to look at this example. Example 1, we want to factor a times a plus 3 plus 4 times a plus 3. Now this is two separate terms. This is a term and this is a term. So remember, terms are separated by plus or minus signs. And because these are being multiplied, this is two things being multiplied, those are considered to be together. And what we want to do is look at these two terms and see what they have in common. And if you look at them, what they have in common is this x plus 3. So we want to factor out that a plus 3. Did I say x plus 3? I meant to say a plus 3. So factor out this a plus 3. That's what they have in common. And then you want to write what you have left. So if you take out this a plus 3, you're left with an a. And if you take out this a plus 3, you're left with a plus 4. So this is how you would factor out the GCF of this polynomial or expression, whatever you want to call it. So let's look at another one like this, okay? So we're going to look at another example like the last one, where it's just a simple factor out the GCF of these two terms, where the terms involve some more terms inside of a parenthesis. So if you look at this term and this term, there are two terms here because the minus sign is what separates these two. What do they have in common? They have an x plus 1 in common. So we want to pull out an x plus 1, and we're going to write what's left after pulling out the x plus 1 in parentheses. So if I take out this x plus 1 here, I'm left with x squared. If I take out this x plus 1 here, I'm left with minus 5. And so this is how you would factor that expression, okay? And this is going to help us to factor by grouping. So now let's look at how do you factor by grouping. So now let's look at how you factor by grouping. So remember, you use factor by grouping when there are four terms. And how many terms do we have in this example? This is example 3, 2x plus 6 plus ax plus 3. There is 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So you always want to try factor by grouping when there's four terms. Okay, step 1. Step 1 is you want to group the first two terms together, and then you want to group the second two terms together. Grouping them together means writing them in parentheses. So the first two terms are these two. So I want to write these two in parentheses. The second two terms, and you'll always put a plus sign in between them, no matter what. Always put a plus sign in between them, and whatever this sign is stays with that term right there. So when I group these two terms together, I get ax plus 3a. So that's step 1, simple. Just put the first two terms in parentheses and the last two terms in parentheses. All right, step 2. Step 2, what you want to do is you want to factor out the GCF in each group. So there are two groups. You've broken it down into two groups. Now you're going to take out the GCF for the first group and the GCF for the second group. All righty. So what is the GCF for 2x and 6? Well, 2 is prime, so the only factor of 2 is 2. So that means if 6 has a 2 in it, then that's what the GCF is. And 6 does. 6 is 2 times 3. So these have a 2 in common. So you want to pull out a 2. Now this one has an x, but this one don't. So I can't pull out an x. If I take out a 2, remember I divide to see what's left. 2 divided by 2 cancels. That leaves me with x. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that leaves me with x plus 3. Alrighty. Now what do these two terms have in common? There is no number on this one, so we can't pull out a number. But they both have an a in common. So I could pull out an a. I keep my plus sign there. When I pull out an a here, so essentially I'm dividing by a to figure out what's left. The a's cancel, leaves me with the x. Divide this one by a. The a's cancel and leave me with the 3. So now the whole goal of factor by grouping is to get what's inside the parentheses to make that the same. And if it's the same, then you can factor this even further. And so this ends up looking like the first two examples we did in this video, which is where you have two terms that have the parentheses in common. So they both have an x plus 3 in common. So you can pull out the x plus 3, and what you're left with, if you take out the x plus 3 here, you're left with a 2. Take out the x plus 3 here, you're left with the a. And so this factors in the x plus 3 times 2 plus a. That is how you would factor by grouping. So the last step, I didn't mention it, is actually to factor the full expression by pulling out the GCF of each term. Okay, so that's how you would factor by grouping. Let's look at another example. All right, example 3, we want to factor 6ax plus 24x plus a plus 4. So how many terms are there? There are 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So whenever there's 4 terms, you want to try factor by grouping. So the first step of factor by grouping is to put the first 2 terms together in parentheses. So group the first 2 terms and group the last 2 terms, and always separate those parentheses with a plus sign. Alrighty, so now you want to look and see, what do these 2 terms have in common? So 6 and 24. So 6, if you have to go back to break it down, that's 2 times 3. 24 is 8 times 3. 8 is 2 times 4. 4 is 2 times 2. So this is 2 times 3, and this is 2 to the 3rd times 3. What do they have in common? They have a 2 and a 3 in common. So your GCF is 2 times 3, which is 6. So pull out a 6 here. But look at the variables. They also have an x in common. So you can also pull out an x. And so what are you left with in the parentheses? Divide out the 6x, and you're left with the a, because the 6's will cancel, the x's will cancel. Divide out the 6x here. 24 divided by 6 is 4, and then the x's cancel. Alrighty. Here, these 2 terms have nothing in common because there's no number here, so you don't have a number to pull out. And then there's no a here, so there's nothing in common to pull out. So that would stay a plus 4. However, you need to write something in front of the parentheses, so you'll write an understood 1 in front of the parentheses. Now, the reason you got to put something in front of the parentheses is because if you look at these, both of these terms have an a plus 4 in common, which means you need to pull out an a plus 4, and then you want to write what's left after you pull out the a plus 4. So if you pull out the a plus 4 here, you're left with the 6x. If you pull out the a plus 4 here, if you didn't have anything right there, then you would probably end up writing nothing. And if you write nothing, that's incorrect. So you have to write the plus 1 there. So that's why you have to put something in front of those parentheses before you pull out that common term. And so this ends up factoring into a plus 4 times 6x plus 1. Okay, this is the last example we're going to work. And this one, we want to factor 10x squared minus 12y plus 15x minus 8xy. So the question is always, when you look at these, how do you know where to start? Well, look at how many terms there are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So whenever there's 4 terms, you want to try factor by grouping. So we'll start factor by grouping the first 2 terms together, and then grouping the last 2 terms together. Then you want to factor out the GCF in each set of terms. So what do these 2 terms have in common? The 10 and the 12 has a factor of 2 in common, but the variables don't have anything in common. So the only thing you can factor out here is a 2. If you divide this by 2, you're left with 5x squared. If you divide this by 2, you're left with minus 6y. Well, what do these 2 terms have in common? So if you look at the numbers, 2 goes into 8, but 2 doesn't go into 15, or 3 goes into 15, but it don't go into 8. 5 go into 15, don't go into 8. So the numbers have nothing in common, but there's an x in common. So you can pull out an x, and you're left with 15 minus 8y. So once you pull out the GCF in each set of parentheses, if you look and you see what's left is not the same. So usually with factor by grouping, it works because what you have left after pulling out the GCF is the same. But in this case, it's not the same. Now, that could mean one or two things. One, it could possibly still be factored by switching some terms around and trying it again. Or 2, it cannot be factored. So if it cannot be factored, that will be considered a prime polynomial. But what we could do before we say it can't be factored is try switching some of the terms around and try factor by grouping again. So this way didn't work. I'm going to erase this. Alrighty. So hopefully you had this wrote down. If not, pause the video and write it down. All right. So we're going to try switching some terms around. Now, what am I looking for when I switch the terms around? Well, I'm looking for terms that share terms, or that share variables or numbers. And so what I want to try to do is I'm just going to try to switch these two. because this one has an x in it, right? This has the x squared, and so I really need to be able to pull out an x in this second term. And so I could either try by putting the 15x here or the 8xy here. I'm just going to switch these two, okay? And you can play around with it and see. It still might work if you put the 15x there. All right, you just have to play around with it and see. So I'm going to move the 8xy here, and I'm going to put the 12y here. So all I did was switch these two terms. This is still equivalent to that expression. I just wrote it differently. So now I'm going to group the first two terms together. And I'm going to group, oh, this is supposed to have a y in it. I'm going to group the last two terms together. What do these two terms have in common? If you look at the numbers, 2 go into both of those. 2 is the biggest number that goes into both of those. And then these both have an x in them. So if I factor out a 2x, divide this by 2x, and that gives me 5x. If I factor out a 2x here, 8 divided by 2 is 4. The x's cancel, and that leaves me with 4y. Now, what do these two have in common? These both have a multiple of 3. That's the biggest multiple that they have in common. So pull out the 3. If I divide the 3 here, that leaves me with 5x. If I divide the 3 here, that leaves me with minus 4y. So now this is going to work because what's inside the parentheses is the same. So now I can pull out the 5x minus 4y. If I take out 5x minus 4y here, I'm left with 2x. If I take out 5x minus 4y here, I'm left with plus 3. And so this is what that ends up factoring into. And so we did factor by grouping. It didn't work at first, but we were able to go and switch some of the terms around, and then it ended up working. This is how you factor by grouping. If you have any questions whatsoever, make sure you put them in the comments below. If you haven't already, subscribed to the channel, and thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video.